So I wasn't here last week, and it feels like so much has happened in such a short amount of time. I don't know about you, but I'm having a hard time keeping up with what I should be worried about, what I should be scared of, what I should be outraged over. It's all moving so fast, it's hard to know what to focus on. Just 2 months ago, we were being pounded by the pandemic's biggest wave so far, the Omicron surge that slammed hospitals and canceled Christmas. Now our governments are basically saying we just need to live with COVID. 2 weeks ago, our country was in the throes of an existential crisis about the nature of freedom. Now the horns have stopped blaring in Ottawa, and the invasion of Ukraine has shown what a real fight for freedom looks like. And of course, what's going on in Ukraine is not the only conflict on the planet. There's still Afghanistan and Syria. There's still Myanmar and Yemen. The Somali civil war still rages. And it's not like climate change has gone away. That's still a thing, a very big thing. And so is anti-black racism and Islamophobia. And they're still finding bodies of children in former residential schools. We're pulled in so many different directions. Everything is moving so fast, it's hard to know where to focus. And in the midst of these overwhelmingly large national and global issues, we have our own issues to deal with. They may seem small in comparison, but they are our issues, so they don't feel small to us. The day-to-day struggles of work and family, the searching for meaning and belonging, loneliness and depression, addiction, sickness, grief, the day-to-day real-world struggles and temptations that can rage within us as fiercely as any war of arms. This is all moving so fast. There's so much noise, so many draws on our attention and energy. It's hard to know where to focus. One of the most sacred responsibilities of being in ministry is the privilege of journeying with a family as they experience the death of a loved one. As you may have heard, we have hit a pastoral rough patch as a community, with a number of our folks passing away in a short period of time. Since the last time we were together, I officiated 4 funerals over 8 days. 4 of our dear ones are no longer with us. Our beloved Carlos, who journeyed with grace and compassion alongside his family and the children of this congregation for so many years as a Sunday school teacher. Our brother Linton, the cryptic puzzle solver whose love compelled him to be an ally in the breaking of glass ceilings for a fuller participation of women in ministry and education and society. Gentle Chris Alex, who only had 13 years among us, but in his all too short time was an embodiment of courage and brought a lifetime's worth of joy to his family and his communities. And Anne, our dear Anne, the storyteller, whose deep care for others brought everyone she encountered into the great story of God's love. It is a unique privilege to journey with people as they experience the death of a loved one. It is hard. It is also a gift to get to know what was important to someone, to understand their vision for their lives and for the world. It is also a gift because when we encounter death, it forces us to encounter our own mortality and just how precious life is, to use Mary Oliver's words, this one wild and precious life. With every funeral, I come away with a new appreciation for my life as a sacred gift from God and a deep desire to not waste one moment of it. Amidst all the distractions, death has a way of sharpening the focus. If you were to do a public opinion poll of Christians about what season of the church was their favorite, I would wager a rent payment that not too many people would say Lent. Most people would either say Christmas or Easter. That's certainly when our churches and live streams are the fullest. But not me. My favorite is most definitely Lent, and not just because I look fabulous in purple. From the dust to dust of Ash Wednesday, to the confessions and lamentations each Sunday, to the foot washing on Maundy, Thursday, to the extinguishing of light on Good Friday, to the great waiting of the Easter Vigil, I love it all. Lent gets a bad rap, I think. It's often oversimplified to a flavorless, gray gruel season of austerity, to the notion of giving something up for the Lord, of denying ourselves of something we like or makes us feel good, chocolate or Netflix or rollerblading. And yes, giving up certain things may be part of our Lenten practices, but we should understand why we are giving them up. What is at stake for us in these practices? The 40 days of Lent are meant to mirror the 40 days that Jesus spent in the wilderness that we heard from our Luke reading a few minutes ago. Now, the narrative location of this story is important. It comes directly after Jesus' baptism in the Jordan, where the Spirit descends on him, and he hears a voice calling him God's own child. Then directly after the wilderness experience, Jesus enters the synagogue in Nazareth, unrolls the scroll of Isaiah, and declares his mission to bring good news to the poor and to proclaim God's vision of a world of peace and equity. But in between the call and the mission, we have this 40-day pilgrimage in the wilderness. Jesus doesn't fully discern his call. He can't embark on his mission without going through this time of temptation, testing, and trial. He needs this time set apart to focus and clarify what is truly important. Luke narrates the encounter between Jesus and the personification of evil in the figure of the devil. The outward experience mirrors the inner reality. And so what we see is Jesus being confronted with his inner demons. He's being confronted with what he fears, the fears that speak to the heart of the human experience. Fear of pain and discomfort, the fear of loss of control and agency, the fear of death. If, like Jesus, we allow ourselves to be led by the Spirit on this pilgrimage to the inner wilderness, a spiritual depth and preciousness of life is revealed as we encounter our own fears and respond to our own temptations, trials, and tests. In Lent, we are encouraged to embrace a more intentional way of life. Lent is not just an idea. It is not just something in the head. This season leads us into specific actions of specific discipline through specific practices of prayer and reflection and embodied action. We are invited into a life of asceticism. Asceticism from the Greek askesis, meaning to train. Just as we train our body for a sport or our brain for a test, we also need training in our spiritual life. Training to let go of the noise and distractions and constant pulls on our energies. Training to recognize our reactionary tendencies and the crutches we use to avoid pain or fear. We need to train to have the strength to let go of anything that is harming our relationship with Christ and our ability to trust and serve God. The Russian Orthodox theologian Alexander Shmemin talks about Lent as a season of bright sadness, where by encountering and understanding our inner demons and fears and developing spiritual discipline, we can reach a place where the constant fusses of life have no access, no power over us. We begin to feel lighter, happier, freer, as if our soul has touched another world, as if our soul has touched another world. Jesus encountered evil on his Lenten pilgrimage, but led by the Spirit, he emerged with good news on his lips. He knew who he was. He knew what he must do, even though it was not what everyone else expected him to do. Let us be reminded that within the context of first century Judaism, the Messiah that most people were expecting, including his followers, was a great military figure in the model of King David, who would vanquish the Roman Empire through military might and restore Israel to its rightful place in God's order. But emerging from his pilgrimage in the wilderness, Jesus understood that this would not be his mission. His journey would not end on a throne in a palace. It would end on a cross, on a hill. Death has a way of sharpening the focus. The book of Deuteronomy was written by the priestly class of Israelites around the time of the Babylonian exile to tell and preserve the story of the nation. The passage that Fran read for us describes liturgical acts of presenting first fruits of the harvest and retelling the story of the liberation from Egypt, which begins with these words: "A wandering Aramaean was my ancestor." This identification with the ancestry of Abraham forms a specific identity for the Jewish people. And as I read it this week, it got me thinking about my identity, the story of my people, and what I might be called to remember and retell. You see, wandering Ukrainian immigrants were my ancestors. These ancestors came to this country with hopes of a better life in the early 20th century as part of the mass exodus of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who were living in crushing poverty and under the yoke of oppressive regimes. Many, like my family, were drawn to homesteads in Western Canada. They worked the land, began families, and formed communities. Then World War I hit. In these days, when the world is very rightly focused on Ukraine, I think it is important to remember and retell a part of the Ukrainian immigrant experience that perhaps not many Canadians know. From 1914 to 1920, the fear and political climate around the war allowed the Canadian government to invoke the War Measures Act and to classify immigrants from various ethnic groups, including Ukrainians, as aliens of enemy nationality. Thousands of Ukrainian men and women and children were interned at government camps and work sites. Many of these captives were used as forced labor in Canada's national parks. If you've ever been to Banff National Park, much of the infrastructure of the town, recreation facilities, the hiking trails, the ski hills, golf course, tennis courts, were built by these Ukrainian people under dismal and unsafe working conditions by force of Canadian law. When we are scared as individuals and as nations, when we act in reactionary and undisciplined ways out of our fear and anxiety, we can end up scapegoating and hurting innocent people. We are pulled in so many different directions right now. Everything is moving so fast. We are obviously focused on the Russian invasion of Ukraine right now, and we are called to muster our collective support for the most vulnerable in this conflict. But let us also have the discipline to see how fear may affect our decision-making. Let us be mindful of mistakes of the past and not let the pendulum of support for the Ukrainian people swing towards scapegoating of the Russian people who have nothing to do with this. There is real evil in this world that must be confronted, But this does not extend to all Russians, those in their homeland, or those who have left to form new lives in places like Canada. Even when we're scared, especially when we are scared, we must resist the temptations of scapegoating, of reactionary violence, and of vengeance. At the end of our gospel passage this week, Luke writes, "When the devil had finished every test, he departed from him until an opportune time." Until an opportune time. Despite Jesus' victory over evil in the wilderness, the devil was not gone for good. There would be one final temptation. After what would be his last supper that we will remember and retell here today, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives to pray, and his prayers were of anguish and terror, and his sweat became like blood. "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me." We often see this last temptation as the impulse to give up in the face of pain and death. But perhaps the devil had laid another trap. Perhaps the real temptation was to become the kind of Messiah that everyone expected him to be, the Messiah that didn't have to die. He had been rallying people to him for months. He had just processed into Jerusalem like a new David. The power of the Holy Spirit was flowing through him like lightning. He could take up arms. He could rally the people to his banner. He could overthrow the vanquishers and make them hurt like they had hurt. Just sound the cry of war. He could be the one sitting in the golden halls and passing judgments, beautiful and powerful, feared and loved. You don't have to die. You don't have to die, the devil whispers in his ear. You can be a king. You can be a God. It is absolutely right and just that a people under siege from evil should protect themselves. And history certainly demonstrates that there are times when not fighting is the greater evil. But as Christians, we must also be mindful that we journey with the one who resisted the temptations of reactionary violence and vengeance, the one who put an end to scapegoating through sacrificial love, the one whose victory over evil, even death on the cross, came by placing his trust in God. My Guido is grandpa in Ukrainian. My Guido Edward died in 2009. I went to his funeral and the eulogy was read by a friend. It was a eulogy that Guido wrote himself in the third person, and it constituted his manifesto on life. What was important to him, what was precious to him, his pride in family and his Ukrainian heritage, the vision he had for the world, the vision he wanted to share with those of us like me who would carry on the family story. As I embark on my Lenten pilgrimage this year and find myself being pulled in so many different directions, Guido's words help focus my attention. He writes, "A man's life can be measured not merely by his achievements, but by his vision for the world. Edward envisioned a world where all work to build communities without hunger or poverty, where everyone has opportunity for education and meaningful employment, will all have access to decent housing and clean water and health care, where weapons of destruction are beaten into plowshares to build a world of peace." Edward's ideals are encapsulated in a quote credited to Dwight Eisenhower. "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in a final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, from those who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children. In this season of Lent, we are invited into the space between our call and our mission. This is a holy pilgrimage. This is time set apart to discern what is important to us, what we will do with this one wild and precious life. We have these 40 days to encounter our temptations, our inner demons, that which we fear. And in these 40 days, we will fail, we will fall. But the discipline comes in starting again and again and again with Christ. The bright sadness of this season is experienced through the training to trust in God. God who can overcome every evil, who can overcome every fear, who can overcome even death with resurrection love. A blessed Lent to you. Amen.